In America's housing market, eviction has become a weapon, but sometimes that weapon backfires. In Oakland, California, a landlord marched into court, confident they could force a woman out of her home. What they didn't realize was that this woman was not just a tenant. She was the building's rightful owner. The sound of the clock ticking grows louder, symbolizing the countdown to homelessness. And then silence. This is the story of Cecilia Carey, a woman nearly erased by an eviction she never should have faced. And the moment a landlord discovered their own power wasn't as absolute as they thought. Oakland, California. It's 2019, and the city is in the grip of a housing crisis. Families are being priced out of their neighborhoods. Luxury condos rise on blocks where working-class residents once lived. And in a quiet building, Cecilia Carey opens her door to find an envelope taped to the frame. Inside, an eviction notice. It claims she has no right to remain. It gives her a date to vacate. The document is cold, bureaucratic, but for Cecilia, it feels like a death sentence. She sits at her small kitchen table, the notice trembling in her hands. She's lived in Oakland for years. She knows the pressures of gentrification, but never in her life did she think she would be branded as someone who didn't belong in her own home. The landlord, a real estate investor group, had purchased the building as part of Oakland's rapidly growing speculative market. Their goal was simple: clear out existing residents, renovate, and re-rent at a much higher price. Cecilia was just another name on their list. Who was Cecilia Carey? Not wealthy, not powerful, but deeply rooted in Oakland's story. She was an artist, a community member, someone who had carved out a fragile stability in a city that was becoming increasingly hostile to people like her. She had purchased her stake in the building years earlier through a cooperative housing arrangement, an alternative ownership model that gave resident security without the instability of traditional rental agreements. But somewhere in the shuffle of paperwork, in the complexity of housing law, and in the aggressiveness of investors, that truth had been buried. Cecilia had never imagined she would need a fight to prove she belonged in her own home, but now she had no choice. The courtroom is fluorescent and unforgiving. On one side, lawyers representing the investor landlords, armed with thick folders. They argue that Cecilia is a tenant who has overstayed her welcome. They demand the court enforce the eviction. On the other side, Cecilia, quiet but resolute. She presents her documents, proof of her ownership stake, proof that she cannot be evicted from her own property. The judge listens, sifts through the evidence. The tension builds. The landlord's attorneys grow restless. Their confidence begins to crack. And then, the revelation. Cecilia is not a tenant. She is an owner. The eviction filing collapses under the weight of this fact. The courtroom murmurs. For Cecilia, relief mixes with anger. The attempt to erase her had failed, but only because she had the strength, knowledge, and courage to fight back. To understand the weight of this moment, we have to step back. Oakland in 2019 was a battlefield. Housing prices had skyrocketed. According to local reports, average rent in Oakland had jumped more than 70% in the previous decade. Eviction filings in Alameda County rose alongside. Investors from outside the community, sometimes from outside the country, were buying up buildings, targeting longtime residents for removal. For tenants, eviction wasn't just about losing a home. It was about losing a community, a sense of belonging, a place in the city story. For landlords, eviction was often just business, a step toward profit. But Cecilia Carey's case exposed a deeper arrogance. Some landlords weren't just evicting tenants. They were trying to evict people who actually owned the buildings. News of Cecilia's case spread quickly through activist networks. Housing justice groups pointed to her as an example of the predatory culture of eviction. For the investor landlord, the case was an embarrassment. They had moved too quickly, assumed too much. For Cecilia, it was vindication, but the damage wasn't undone. The fear she had lived with during those weeks of uncertainty lingered. The trust in the system was broken. Still, her story lit a spark. If a landlord can try to evict someone who owns their own home, activists asked, how many other wrongful evictions are going unchecked? Cecilia Carey's case was shocking, but it was not unique, because in New York, Another woman would soon find herself in a similar fight battling a landlord who tried to throw her onto the street without the right to do so. And what happened in the Bronx would reveal that this was not a mistake. It was a pattern. If Oakland was a warning shot, the Bronx was a war cry, because when another landlord tried to erase a woman from her own home, and when that woman fought back, it exposed something larger, a system that too often protects profit over people. The camera opens on the Bronx skyline. Subways rattle, horns blare, and a mother clutches her child's hand as they walk past a line of tenants waiting for housing court. This is the story of Myrna Marmolejos, a woman who stood on the edge of eviction and refused to be pushed over. Myrna Marmolejos had lived in her Bronx apartment for years. It wasn't glamorous cracked paint, leaky pipes, a neighborhood shaped by cycles of poverty and resilience, but it was home. She was not wealthy. She was not politically connected. She was simply a woman raising her family, trying to hold on to stability in a city where stability felt like a luxury. Her landlord, however, had different plans. One morning, taped to Myrna's door was a piece of paper. Bold letters screamed, "Notice to vacate." The landlord claimed unpaid rent. They claimed she had no legal right to remain. They claimed authority. But much like in Oakland, the claims didn't match reality. Myrna was not behind on rent. She was not a squatter. She was a tenant with rights. Yet the landlord pressed forward, filing in housing court, confident they could force her out. Housing court in the Bronx is nothing like a grand, dignified courtroom drama. It's crowded, chaotic, and overwhelming. Dozens of cases are heard in a single morning. Tenants shuffle in, clutching documents, many without lawyers. Landlords arrive armed with attorneys and deep pockets. For most tenants, the odds are stacked against them. Myrna walked in, determined not to be another statistic. She held on to her lease agreements, her payment records, her proof. And when the case was heard, the truth became clear. The landlord's claims were false. The eviction attempt collapsed. Myrna's story wasn't an isolated case. According to housing justice groups, tens of thousands of eviction filings in New York City each year are frivolous, retaliatory, or outright illegal. Some landlords bank on the fact that tenants don't know their rights. Others use eviction as a scare tactic, filing repeatedly to pressure tenants into leaving voluntarily. For Myrna, the attempt was personal. It shook her family. It destabilized her sense of safety. But for advocates, her case was proof of something larger, a pattern of abuse of the eviction system. When activists compared Myrna's case to Cecilia Carey's in Oakland, the parallels were chilling. In both cases, landlords or investor groups tried to weaponize eviction without legal grounds. In both cases, women with limited resources had to defend themselves against powerful interests. And in both cases, justice was only served because the women fought back. How many people don't fight back? Advocates asked, how many are forced onto the street without ever realizing the eviction was unlawful? The drama of these cases fed into a growing movement. In Oakland, groups like Moms for Housing had already captured headlines by occupying a vacant investor-owned home, demanding recognition of housing as a human right. In New York, tenant unions were forming across neighborhoods, arming renters with knowledge of their rights and building collective power against predatory landlords. Cecilia and Myrna's cases became rallying points, proof that landlords were overstepping and that the courts would be forced to listen when tenants resisted. But for the women at the center, the victories came at a cost. Cecilia spoke of the sleepless nights, the feeling of being hunted in her own home. Myrna recalled the humiliation of being treated like she didn't belong in the place she had raised her family. Both women knew they had won battles, but the war for housing justice was far from over. In 2019, over 230,000 eviction cases were filed in New York City alone. In Oakland, black residents were twice as likely to face eviction compared to white residents, despite making up a smaller share of the population. Nationwide, studies show that most eviction filings are for small amounts of rent, often less than $600. Legal aid attorneys and housing advocates explain that eviction has become a business model. File repeatedly, pressure tenants, and eventually reclaim the unit for higher rents. The most dramatic moment of Cecilia's case And the one that gave the story its viral headline was a revelation that she was not a tenant at all, but a partial owner of the building. That fact stunned observers, but experts warn the line between ownership and tenancy is not always clear. Cooperative housing, shared equity models, and informal agreements often blur legal categories. Landlords, or in some cases, predatory investors, exploit this confusion, banking on residents not having the resources to fight back. Oakland, then overcrowded housing court benches in the Bronx. Cecilia Carey, Myrna Marmolejos. Two women on opposite coasts. Two eviction attempts that should never have happened. Both stood their ground. Both reveal the arrogance of a system where property is valued over people. But for every Cecilia and Myrna, there are thousands whose names we will never know. Families forced out, homes lost, lives uprooted. And the question remains, if the system allows landlords to file baseless evictions so easily, how many more injustices are still hidden waiting to be uncovered? Housing is a human right.